Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Gonna let people start to trickle in here. We already have a good number, which is awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. I am Erica Shoemaker from the EdTech Leaders Alliance, although my name here says Learn 21 webinar. And I am just here to be your cruise director, get things started. I'm going to kick it over to Kevin Ghantous here in just a moment. But I wanted to make sure that you knew about some of our upcoming webinars and things that you can get involved in at ETLA this summer before we get started. So the first is we have a webinar on May 21st from our corporate council member, InfoCase, who is wonderful and lovely, and we can't wait. Their webinar is from ROI to Return on Instruction, and that is May 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will put all the links for everything that I am about to talk to you about in the chat as soon as I'm done talking. I can't do two things at once. We also have a webinar called Rewriting the Script with the lovely and talented Carly Ghantous, looking at writing in the age of AI and post-plagiarism. And that will be June 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I'd love to remind you to register for the ETLA conference, or if you are interested in presenting at the ETLA conference, we are doing our second round of proposals, and that window opens on May 15th and closes on June 15th. So I know school year is wrapping up right now. It may be hard, but that June window, use those 2 weeks while your brain is still fresh from the school year and all the things that you'd like to do next year to submit a proposal for the conference. And we'd love to have you at the conference. I also wanted to mention really quick that we do have an EdTech coaching certificate. Our next cohort is starting in the fall, and you can learn more information and sign up for that at our website, edtechleadersalliance.org. And Kevin is going to be sharing a lot about Agentic AI. And this webinar came about because he wrote articles in our newsletter, Bites and Insights, about Agentic AI and just could not stop, which is totally fine. We love it. And I said, Kevin, there's so much information here. Let's do a webinar. And being the lovely, kind person he is, he said, okay. So I made him do this based on his writing for Bites and Insights. I'm also going to share the link to the Bites and Insights articles that inspired this webinar in case you would like to visit that. There will also be a link to register to sign up for Bites and Insights in case you're not on our mailing list already. And then the last thing in here, I know I just am throwing a lot at you, is Kevin will be sharing a lot about Agentic AI. One of the things that I think he may be sharing, and if not, you can check it out on your own, is on our ETLA tools website, which we did a webinar highlighting all of the tools that we have. And one of them is related to Agentic AI. So I wanted to make sure you had all of those links. That was a lot from me. There you go. They're all in the chat now. And we are just so delighted and excited that you're here. And Kevin is excited too, even though I was like, you're doing a webinar, yay. But it's going to be great. And I can't wait for y'all to hear what he's been working on, what he's been thinking about. And I think it's just going to be really dynamic and interesting. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin, who can tell you who he is and what he's going to do.
All right. Well, thank you, Erica. I feel like I have to raise my excitement level and my dynamicness for the rest of this webinar. So I appreciate you setting the bar so high. All right. So for those who don't know me, my name is Kevin Ghantous. I'm one of the co-founders of Learn 21. Actually, I have slides, so let me do that first, just to give the full experience. All right. So again, my name is Kevin Ghantous. I'm one of the co-founders of Learn 21. Um, And today I wanted to really take an opportunity not just to kind of reshare what is in those Bites and Insights articles, which I think are great, and really provide a lot of perspective around what the opportunities look like, with Agentic AI moving forward. And if you do have an opportunity, definitely check those out because it talks about how, as much we talk about AI in education, and I think quite often we feel like we're being pressed into doing AI and using AI, and our students are using AI. And so often we feel like we're kind of behind. Reality is that when you look at our standards and you look at kind of what the expectations are in terms of leveraging AI tools and thinking forward into what do jobs look like in the future. And obviously things are always shifting, always changing. The cornerstone of a lot of our teaching standards and best practices lend very well into developing AI tools and developing AI workflows and agentic AI applications. And this conversation and those articles is really about, I feel like educators just need the opportunity to understand and experience what an agentic AI process looks like, so that they have some grounding and that they have their own opportunities, ideally in their schools, to explore these types of tools to start to build some familiarity so that they can bring that back into their classroom and they can teach about the standards that they're teaching today, but how they apply into an agentic AI space. And so, stepping into this, I really wanted to kind of set the foundation around something that we're all fairly familiar with, and it's this concept of generative AI. And with generative AI itself, it's whether you've used a ChatGPT, you use Claude, Gemini, Magic School, any of these types of tools, um, you're probably fairly familiar with this. It's a tool that's typically a chatbot. It has the capabilities of generating content. So maybe you ask a question, it generates a paragraph or a paper or a book or an image. And then you kind of just decide, like, yeah, that works. No, it doesn't. And you either go through a chat dialogue with it, or you kind of just accept that work and then you modify it and customize it for yourself. That's kind of the basics of what most people think of when they think about using AI. And we think about as our students are using AI, they're doing that for either just trying to learn a concept, possibly generating their own content. Uh, but again, it's really just anchored in that idea of generative work. They're just building something um, that is kind of a one use. I ask a question, I get a response type of process. Where the generative AI shift into agentic AI occurs is that we're moving out of this idea of asking questions and getting responses to really thinking about workflows and processes. And through the presentation today, I want to kind of walk through and building up an understanding of how agentic AI processes and workflows look different from generative. I want to provide a few examples of that so that you can start to kind of wrap your own head around how do I jump into the space and have a level of familiarity or comfort if you're wanting to work independently. But at the same time, this also becomes the foundations for doing more automated tasks. And I will share with InLearn 21, not that we've had a hard push into Agentic, but we've kind of leaned into this just through our work and our practices. Um, and often you hear maybe terms like vibe coding or OpenClaw, those types of tools. Those are either processes or systems that help provide agentic AI workflows and processes. And so all of this really becomes those foundations for doing those types of additional tasks and starting to kind of just grow your awareness. All right. So when we think of what makes AI agentic, it's this idea of it has agency or it's an agent. So it's essentially you're trying to build out an AI that can work independently and actually serves as a work partner, not just a responder. So again, that idea of generative is really you're asking a question, you're getting a response, where an agent, when done well, can actually function completely independent, or it functions with very little prompting. We talk about this idea of prompt engineering, and you have to be able to write a very long prompt. You have to do a lot of different frameworks and patterns to make sure you get the right kind of response out of the system, all of those things. And what the agentic approach does is it says, we do need to have content that's available for the AI to be able to do the work, but we break that into these three areas of tools, skills, and context. And tools really kind of get presented depending on the platform you're using in a lot of different ways. But tools fundamentally is the ability for you to take the AI and plug it into other systems. So if you're a school that uses Google AI, uses Gemini, you may find that there is the ability within Gemini to connect into your Google Drive or into your Google Calendar. Um, and what you're doing is without having to download data and then provide it as part of your prompt or part of your chat, the system is actually capable of linking into those systems. And often you'll hear terms like MPC server, and that's just a protocol for AI to be able to communicate with other systems. But often they can do it through AI or APIs, they can do it through plugins. But kind of the general term is really it's tooling or providing tools to the AI system so that it can connect in. I've often seen tools or MPC servers that are implemented for different SISs, different LMSs. And so these systems are trying to provide the hooks and the availability of some of that data to allow AI systems to be able to connect into them. The second one is around skills, and this really leans back into that prompt engineering concept. And this is ultimately around how do you write up the instruction set, a good pre-built set of instructions, so that your AI can leverage those skills or instructions to perform tasks asynchronously. And what you're really trying to achieve is the capability for an AI system to have a library or catalog of skills that it can lean into, and through some of its reasoning mechanics, it's able to say, "Oh, you've asked me to create a Google Doc or a Word doc, and there's a skill specialized for doing that task." You may have skills that are things that you've built, and we're going to do a couple demonstrations today around can you evaluate a product or resource to tell us if it is properly using data privacy. So as kind of an audit or an evaluation before you submit that data privacy agreement, building a skill to be able to help do that firsthand audit. Um, and so those skills are things that you can build yourself. Those are skills can be shared, just like any other good prompt. And quite often, when I find good prompts that people have built, I'll work to turn those into skills. And so we're going to go through the skill building process through the conversation today as well, so that you can kind of get a good handle on that. And then the first or the third part is context, and it's really about the memory. And if you've done any sort of chat long enough, you'll start to recognize the fact that you can start a conversation with ChatGPT, again, Gemini or Claude or Magic School, one of those systems, and your chat starts to kind of break down over time. It starts to forget things. It doesn't have quite the same context it did at the beginning. Um, I like to think of it as a large language middle schooler, LLM, large language middle schooler, in the sense that I have a daughter who's a middle schooler, and sometimes I give her instructions at the beginning, and sometimes those instructions start to fade during the end of her execution. And so that is actually a natural problem that exists within a lot of AI systems, and I won't get into the weeds. Happy to if anyone's interested. But ultimately, it has to do with what are called context windows. And the more information and the more conversation you have with an AI, that context starts to break down or get muddied, and so the AI starts to lose focus. Um, so with the agentic process, what we have are specialized tools and approaches that helps us to carry that information longer term through a memory allocation process. And that can be huge because then we can have multiple chats where the same information is shared and available. And likewise, we can actually feed and continue to grow or strengthen that memory by contributing more relevant information and then having continuous chats without the loss of that information over time. All right. So I'm going to take a step back for a moment, and I'd like to kind of talk about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. If you are either have taught this lesson or maybe experienced the lesson firsthand, this was something that I talked about in the article and I felt was very kind of apt to provide some concreteness to what are we trying to accomplish when we talk about the idea of building context and the idea of skills and the idea of tools. How does that apply in a classroom environment, or how does that apply or look as we're teaching and training students and building those skills? And I remember this lesson was probably about third or fourth grade in an English class where the teacher asked us to write the instructions on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And it was a very iterative process. I remember the teacher standing in the front of the room. She had a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a jar of jelly, and a knife, and simply said, has someone to come up and say, give me instructions on how to build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And more often than not, the first set of instructions was take the peanut butter, put it on the bread. And it ended up looking more like this because the instructions weren't very detailed. They weren't very clear. It was more of just take the jar of peanut butter and put it on top of a loaf of bread. And so the teacher did just that. The details really needed to be around opening the bread, take out two slices, lay them on the table, open the jar, take the knife, insert it into the jar, scoop out, 1 to 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, spread it on the bread, and so forth and so on. And those detailed instructions were the pieces that provided the proper context and provided the proper skills and tooling to build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, to pull back our agentic terminology. And it really was about having the details and the specifics within those instructions so that there was no ambiguity. There was no questions around what was the intent, what were we trying to accomplish. And if you've worked with AI long enough, the models are obviously getting better and better, but we still run into these challenges today where if you don't provide clear context, you don't provide clear instructions, the AI likes to do what's called a hallucination. It starts to make connections that we don't intend. It starts to make assumptions that we don't intend, and it will start to put information into responses that we don't want, or sometimes it will start to just fabricate things that aren't true. And so we always talk about, verifying your sources, verifying your responses, things like that. When you're building agentic processes that are actually performing tasks, this becomes even more important because now it's not just generating information, but it may be drafting an email, creating a newsletter. It may be possibly sending emails out. It could be writing code, building systems. And if it's making assumptions incorrectly, that's where you start to run into problems, issues, inconsistent information, or you start to get that kind of just generic AI response that doesn't feel authentic. And so the cornerstone of the agentic process is really around context engineering. And again, I've kind of touched on this earlier, but the idea of with context engineering, we start out with this idea of, how do I phrase this question? What framework do I use to ask a good question to the AI? And then the context engineering shift is really around what does the system need to know to do this work well? And that in itself can be a very iterative process. That itself can be something that takes time and training to really not just to understand how to provide good instructions, but also to kind of understand those edges of an AI system to say, well, if I say it this way, I know it's probably going to respond or hallucinate. The expectation. And so I need to provide more context. I need to provide more resources to its memory, or I may need to go back and build a specific skill to help guide the agentic system all the way through to my end goal. And this is real work that's happening today. And this skill and this ability to do context engineering is something that the workforce is actually paying up to 56% more for wages. And so this is something that's really happening out in the workforce, and people are looking for these skills as people are trying to figure out how do I adapt and utilize AI in our day-to-day operations. And so helping provide ourselves with the experience to know how to use these tools, which then translates into better instruction for our teachers or for our students rather, um, I think is very important because these are skills that don't just apply to AI, but really apply to just good systems thinking and operations and how, we will work and interact with more of these systems in the future. All right, so we're going to jump into some demos. And so the first thing that I want to do is just show what this prompting and skill building can produce in an AI space. And this is a skill that we already have within our Learn 21 environment. We use as part of our data privacy auditing process. And it's actually built based off of a prompt that we found that was a community contribution that does a really good job of providing different measurements and benchmarks. Now, is it perfect? No, not by any means, but it definitely provides us with a nice foundation that typically would take a person, 15 to 20 minutes to do a single resource evaluation. This prompt, skill, and tooling combined is able to accomplish this in roughly about a minute or less. And so it's definitely a performance improvement of our processes internally. And I thought it's a great example of just what's possible with skills. All right. So I'm using Claude as my platform for doing this demonstration. Again, different tools have different layouts, different options. You can use ChatGPT for this. You can use, if you have the enterprise version of Gemini, you have the capabilities of doing these types of things within Gemini as well. Full transparency, I was trying to figure out if the school version of Gemini actually provides the enterprise functionality, and I wasn't able to determine that in time for this presentation. So there may be tooling for this. I just can't speak to it at the time of this session. Um, so this demo space is really set up for me to just be able to show kind of this evaluation process. I'm able to invoke specific skills that I've built through a slash command in Claude, and I'm looking for my privacy terms advisor skill. And so this skill, again, was something that was already pre-built. Let me jump over here. And this was a prompt that originally was a community contribution that we had found. And so we were able to take this and really just copy and paste it directly in as a skill. And so this skill provides guidance, directions, details around how to do an evaluation of a product or resource. So I'm going to ask it for an evaluation of a tool. I'll use something timely. I'm going to ask it about Canvas. And with this tool and with this tooling, what it's going to do is it's not just going to lean on what the LLM knows, but it's also designed to go out to the internet. It's designed to go out and evaluate current information available around this resource and provide a strong evaluation. At the same time, it's also going to be leaning on certain expectations, depending on if we're looking at it from an adult perspective or a child perspective, to ensure that we're complying with certain things like FERPA and COPA. So I'm just going to type this in to evaluate Canvas. And as you'll see here, it says that it's reading the skill right now. So this is the agent work happening in the background where it's reading the skill. And what I like with Claude is I can peek in here to see what specific steps it's going through as it's doing that evaluation. And it should come back and ask me a few questions. And so as part of that skill, it will prompt for details around what it needs in order to provide a good answer. Now, I've done this before. It's also possible that it already knows me well enough that it's not going to ask me too many questions. All right, yeah. So it just came back here and says I need a user type and region before analyzing. So in this case, you can see here it says who's the intended user. It's asking if it's adult, teen, or child. I'm gonna go ahead and choose child. And it's asking me what region I'm in. So again, these are prompts or questions that are coming from the skill itself. I'll choose the US. And then which canvas do I mean? So it's asking specifically, am I talking about Instructure Canvas LMS or some other option? So it's trying to provide clarity. I could also provide it a URL for a particular company or product, and it's able to parse that directly. So I'll expand this again so you can see that it's going through performing searches on my behalf. I'm not having to search for anything. I'm not having to bring all of that information back. It's doing all of that work and it's looking at additional information, and now it's bringing back its verdict. So this is the response template that was provided as part of the skill. So it's saying use with caution, risk level high, and it's talking about data collection, consistency, and clarity. And it's going through all of these different elements that are, again, part of the skill, and it's doing that evaluation. And so it's pulling out things like what you're agreeing to, what your rights are, key limiters. And again, it's doing all of this, and this executed in about, with a couple of questions, just a couple of minutes. So it was able to go out, find that resource information, all of those details, and bring them back in a matter of minutes. I didn't have to write a strong prompt. I just had to ask a basic question, invoke the skill, and then answer a couple of leading or follow-up questions to provide it with more clarity. All right, so the second example, and I'll definitely take a deeper dive into this one, is around what is, I was trying to think through what is a good example um, that may be applicable for a classroom teacher. So if you're trying to think about how could I test this out, or maybe if you're a building administrator, maybe you need the situation where you have a teacher who's out, they send you that email at 3 or 4 in the morning, and they say, here's my slide deck, or my slide deck is up in my LMS. Here's the assignment for today. I need a sub. I won't be in. um, Allowing Claude through a skill to be able to create subplans just from that information. So the goal is here is simply to invoke that, answer a couple of questions, provide it some basic resources, and allow Claude to then completely generate subplans that could be copy, pasted, exported, and sent off to a sub along with some of those original resources. So doing that quickly and efficiently. All right, so before I jump into asking the question and having it generate, I actually want to walk you through the process that I took to building out this skill. And so I actually started with a conversation. And this conversation was essentially me taking a subplan document, providing it to Claude, and Claude has a skill called a skill creator, so it helps walk you through this process. But ultimately, I said I wanted to create a skill for building subplans. I would provide the actual instructor's material, so things like PowerPoint presentations, assignments, things of that nature, and then I wanted it to be able to build out a subplan based off of that template. And so the skill itself went through and it evaluated the resources I had provided it. It was able to identify that I would be providing things like Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, link to Google Slides, and so forth. And then it would generate an output file. And so from there, it did the work of really generating the skill. And within the skill itself, this becomes essentially the prompt for the skill. And this was the first version of it. And from here, it has its own kind of templated layout of what that response or that um, subplan will look like. And it's got a series of additional questions and conventions. So it's trying to understand and really build for itself. Here are the details. Here are the specific information that needs to be going into that. It Through this conversation, it asked things about timing. Was the length of a class period? How many um, bells or blocks are there in the schedule? And then it talks about handling different types. And this is for an online course, so that it asks about Zoom links and things like that. It actually inferred all of this from the sample subplan that I had given it. So aside from giving it that subplan, it inferred a lot of this from my prompt. So With that, I answered a few questions and it generated all of that. And I now have this attached here as my skill. So this now becomes one of my skills within my Claude. And I'm able to then take this skill and I can invoke it. So I'll go slash subplans, and then I will grab my slide deck and my assignment. And I'll simply say, I need subplans for this class. It will be attached is the PowerPoint and assignment for the students. And so Claude is now reading the skill. It's going through understanding what the output needs to be and possibly what questions it needs to ask. It will also then read the PowerPoint slides, understand what the concept and topics are of the slide deck itself, extracting that text. Um, And then it's also going to look at the docx file to understand what the assignment is. And then part of the template for the subplans is actually chunking out each part of the block of time and providing time estimates for each one of the steps through the subplan so that the sub has an understanding of a certain activity should only take 5 or 10 minutes, a certain activity should take 30 minutes, so that they can understand how should they manage the time within the classroom. And so it has the context now for that plan. But it's asking some additional questions. It wants the class name, the date and the number of blocks, the Zoom link if available, block length, vocab warm up, and is this one or multiple sections. So these are all pieces that through that initial skill build out, it knows to kind of ask for these questions. And these are things that I could have provided as part of the original prompt as well. So there was no need for me to have it ask these questions if it's a skill that I'm familiar with and know what the inputs are. And then I will just copy this and say, one, it's that. Two, I'll say tomorrow, 3 blocks or 4 blocks. Um, Provide later. And I'll say it's a 90-minute block and say standalone activity done daily. And then 6, same lesson for 4 block or for 4 blocks. Now, in this case, I'm providing it that PowerPoint slide and I'm providing it with that assignment detail. If there was an MCP server, perhaps that connected to the learning management system, there would be capabilities to link this chat directly to that MCP server for the LMS. And so there would be a need to upload information. It would simply be, hey, I need a sub for this class. We could provide it a link to the class itself. And through those tooling connections, it would be able to extract the information for the class period and for the lesson for tomorrow. And so in this case, keeping it kind of disconnected and not linking to a live system, we are feeding it the files, but that would be another extension of further automation. And so again, this whole agentic process is very iterative. Sometimes you start very simple and then you go, oh, I can tack on this, or I can add that, or I could remove this question by giving it access to this system or this information. And so that becomes a really big piece in where you can get with an agentic process. Again, it's very iterative, just like that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. First time you fail, you come back again, you improve the process, you improve the process. And then ultimately you end up with a nice, strong skill that doesn't require a lot of prompting and gives you a nice output. And so this was one piece that we actually added to the skill was around class dynamics. So sometimes this is information that's helpful to a sub is, what is the class dynamics for each one of your blocks, for each one of your sections? Are there students that are helpful? Are there any potential behavior concerns to flag? So just being aware of certain students or certain student dynamics, things like that. So this was a piece that we actually added to the skill to ensure that we were kind of covering all of our bases. So we can build that into the skill. The skill then prompts for that information, so it makes it really quick and easy. And so I'm going to say skip for now. And so now it's going to generate those subplans. And so looking through the PowerPoint presentation, looking through the assignment itself, Claude was able to determine what was being taught, the details, provided some pacing for that substitute around each one of those sections in the class. Um, Referred back to the particular resources. So now this could then be exported out, attached to an email, or provided as part of a packet for a substitute teacher, including that PowerPoint presentation and that assignment. And so that's all packaged up nicely and right within this particular skill. And so as I open this conversation, again, I feel like it's important not necessarily to be utilizing these tools in the classrooms. Sometimes it can be, there's concerns about PII, data privacy, things like that. I know a lot of schools today are using systems such as Magic School that don't have these agentic capabilities. And it's a piece that I think will grow in time. In an educational environment, um, you want to kind of be in a safe space in place, both as an educator and the data you're using, but also at the same time, what tools your students are using. But these are things that are out there and commercially available. And I know from at least some leadership conversations that these are tools that districts are exploring and sometimes using at their more of the leadership level. And so starting to really understand what's possible with these tools, I think is really a good growing space, and finding ways to enable your teachers to understand this is equally huge because again, it provides them with context so that as they're going in and they're teaching these standards, they recognize that these standards can map to future skills that will be applicable in the workforce. And so working to really provide these opportunities, I think, is huge in providing more professional development. Again, whether it's your teaching staff, maybe it's your office staff, helping them be more efficient with their day-to-day tasks, or even your own if you are, a building principal, superintendent, someone in the leadership role, finding ways to allow these tools to help you be more efficient. Is definitely a place where you can have strides. Now, with that being said, there's always the caveats around protecting data. um, the all of the work that I've shown here today and the work that we're doing is through a paid account. Free accounts, as most people know, do not have the guardrails and restrictions around data being used for training models, data being used in different other capacities by these businesses. Typically, with paid accounts in the correct configuration, you can limit or eliminate any of your personal private data being used for model training. And so that is a very big piece, whether again, you're using Google Gemini, you're using ChatGPT or Claude, is knowing where those restrictions are and implementing those restrictions appropriately if you are using these tools within your district. Um, so again, just giving educators the experience, I think is really the takeaway from this conversation today, and just having a better grasp and understanding of what's possible with agentic AI. Love to do a follow-up session. thinking out loud. Would love to do a follow-up session really where we dig a little deeper into vibe coding. I think that can really provide a lot of perspective around how to automate processes and what that looks like. At the same time, again, there are standards that exist and a lot of the complementary resources that Erica shared at the beginning of the webinar will provide you with a crosswalk of each one of those agentic skills and what standards at different grade levels are available. And so that's a nice resource that you can provide to teachers if they're wanting to lean more into AI and trying to, make it more relevant for students. They can understand like here's where these skills are important and how they map all the way from K to 12. Those skills are mapped and those standards are mapped rather to those skills. So. And again, just piloting a workflow, keeping it simple. It doesn't need to require PII. So again, like the subplan concept is a great example of that. Allows you to just take information that's not student specific, but be able to utilize those resources in a way to where you can automate a process and eliminate the need for manual work. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. Be happy to stick around and answer any questions in the chat, but I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, if you all have questions, feel free to share them in the chat. Um, and I put all the resources that Kevin mentioned there at the end and here again, as well as the registration links for our upcoming webinars. But yeah, we're happy. I'm not happy because I don't know what I would say, but Kevin is happy to answer any of your questions. I'm happy for Kevin to do it. Oh, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I love it. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We hope you have a good rest of your day. Hopefully, that was a good way to spend your lunch. And feel free to reach out if you do have questions. Kevin at learn21.org is where you can reach Kevin, or Erica at learn21.org. I'll forward it, or anyone else as well. But thank you so much for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Kevin, for
Yep.
sharing. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one, everybody.